All right, folks, welcome today to another podcast. Today, we are actually going to dive into a very interesting subject matter. And today, I have a special guest that has been actually introduced to me through friends that pointed out his expertise in Qatar. And being that my guest today, Dr. Ariel Admoni, he is a fellow for the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and basically an expert in the Middle East, and specifically with Qatar. Has written extensively some articles, done a lot of case studies on this particular subject of Qatar's involvement in the Middle East, and specifically here in Israel. For those who have been tracking or following, you have noticed and heard the President of the United States and Israel having to use Qatar as a medium to bring about the so-called peace talks with Gaza, and essentially with Hamas being the representation of the Gazans. And how does that influence Israel? How does that influence the United States? How does that influence basically the world arena? And I think Qatar is a silent player, so to speak, that works behind the scenes and gets away with a lot. So today, Dr. Admoni, would you please explain a little bit about yourself? Why do you think it is that I have you on this forum right now, and to try to highlight this issue that I think is quite of a little bit of a problem that a lot of the West isn't really familiar with?
So first, thanks for having me. I think that a little bit myself is can explain about this topic. When I began to study this country in 2016, there were actually in Israel people that asked me if I study a real country, and now nobody asks it anymore.
Right.
And I think that it's not just for Israel. I think the awareness, as you mentioned on global stage, the awareness, even in academic research, you can see the monographs that written about Qatar in English. The most recent is 2013. Most of them still debating on the question if it's Islamic State or it's even some call it in some of degree not religious at all. And the fact that this country, although it was very, very influential in Israel and also in the US for more than 3 decades, the knowledge about the state and about its influence formally and informally, it's very, very poor.
Hmm. And that's for Israelis. I mean, what you just said there, I mean, that's for Israelis. So how much more for the West, and how much for Qatar being on anybody's radar, the farther you get away from the Middle East, which I find that to be very interesting. I mean, talk about a country that pulls a lot of weight in the Middle East, especially when it comes to Israel and our influence in the Middle East. And nobody really knows about them. Nobody really has a grasp of what are they for, what are they against, what do they promote? Are they like Israel, that is a nation that is a democracy, that is trying to emulate itself like many other democratic countries in the world, and has a lot to how to say shared values with the West? Does Qatar have any of that?
So first, let me acknowledge the fact that there is an American base in Qatar. And
Right.
when it was announced in the end of the 1990, and there are actually articles that ask the same question about the fact, where is it? We hear about the state for the first time, and we understand it's gonna be important to us to know this place. And actually, the recurring theme that you can hear time and time again in this period of time in the US, that where is it and why there? And I think that this is a great opening to introduce the state. So now we are talking about a state that it's not a democracy at all. It's a
Mm.
dictatorship. It's a dictatorship ruled by heretic ruling family, Al Thani. It's
Mm,
not the only a strong family in the emirate, but this is the most prominent one. It's a tribe, a Bedouin tribe that's in the area, I mean the Arabian Gulf, from the middle of the 18th century, and compared to other ruling families, Al Saud, Saudi Arabia, Sabah in Kuwait, they're actually the youngest, and
mm,
there is a deficit they need to compensate for. And this ruling family actually relied on external forces to gain power: the Saudis and the Ottomans and the British and the most recent, the US. And I think that one prominent theme that you can see in Al Thani for, I don't know, since I think that the 19th century, that Qatar is not loyal to no one.
mm,
Qatar, although it's very small, although it's began with no such amazing resources, we saw that Qatar want to preserve its independence. It's not loyal adherence to no one. We can see actually cases when they anger the Ottomans and Britain, despite the fact they didn't have much power, not against them and not against them. And this is why when we see Qatar today, a state that at the same time talk with terrorists and the US, with France and the Taliban, with I don't know, Al Qaeda affiliates of some sort, and Hamas, of course, and at
mm.
the same time perceived as a respectable member, this is not a bug; it's a feature, because Qatar is not loyal to no one, and Qatar preserved this attitude for a long time.
Hmm. You know, and see, that's what I find to be just so mind-boggling. It's like you have a nation state here in the Middle East that it's another one of the Bedouin tribes that got super wealthy on oil and basically realized that they can become a superpower of sort, right? But they don't really have, to my knowledge, they don't really have anything to bring to the table other than their oil money, right? So what kind of power do they have other than money? You know what I mean? Like, so is that why they're so involved with basically getting their fingers in other countries and other resources in other places?
First of all, yeah, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that unlike the other GCC state, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the most valuable resource of Qatar is not oil, it's gas.
Okay.
I mean, because their Qatar has gas, oil, and since the 1950, 1960, 1970, the oil money was an important factor. But since the late 1980, we saw that Qatar developed its joint North Field with Iran. But unlike Iran, that came late to the party, and until Tehran began to develop its gas mechanism, it took a lot of time.
Hmm.
Qatar was on it from the inception. They knew what they had in their hand, but what Qatar knew also, that first you cannot trust just on energy resource. You
Hmm.
saw it, how it's happening in Saudi Arabia. The fact that eventually oil becoming popular. Sometimes they have less of it. And for that reason, Qatar did, let's say, three important strategies. Sorry. First of all, they understand that this money cannot stand alone. For that reason, we saw an investment authority in Qatar. It's not unique for Qatar, but Qatar took it to art level. We
Hmm.
saw right now there was an article in the last year about the fact that in Britain, Qatar hold more assets than the ruling family of Britain.
Wait,
Qatar
what? I
You
mean,
can you can see it in the news.
that's insane.
Yeah,
That's insane. How is that even legal?
you invest in London, in some water company, in
Hmm.
some Mayfair hotel,
Yeah.
and it seems legitimate, and it is legitimate. I told you so because just 4 days ago, Defense Ministry of Britain came to Doha to sign a defense agreement with them. And that's what Qatar understood. I need a seat in the table. The money will buy me a seat in the table, but
Hmm.
I need to get involved through this money. And this is how they knew first how to use it to buy investment for portfolio that is very, very strong. Second, they knew how to brand themselves. Unlike oil, that seems pollution and yes, Qatar knew to brand itself actually as sustainable and green. And that is how they can
Mm.
maintain even projects with Bill Gates Foundation and the Barbara Bush Foundation because we are pro green. We are what you mentioned as greenwashing.
Right, greenwashing.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the
So
third
they're
part,
progressives. They're progressives, right? They're not your normal Bedouin desert dwellers.
they
You know,
sell
we're
themselves as
we're modern.
progressive.
We're
They
modern.
sell
Yeah.
themselves as progressive. Just in the
Clever.
last year, there was cases in Doha that people arrested without trial. We have actually reports about the death penalty as a threat, not as they actually cancel the limited elections they have. But Qatar knew how to sell itself to the world. As we're
Hmm.
talking right now, the UN Development Summit, whatever, the first summit outside Geneva and New York upheld in New York in Doha
And
because
wow.
Qatar knew how to brand itself as progressive, how to be in favor of development, of the global south, of humanitarian goals. And this is how Qatar knew how to promote itself as an actor that's actually everybody see as they're not problematic. We see the reports about what's happened in the World Cup and all the foreign workers that got killed. Biden didn't mean it. It was an accident. And
Right.
again, we are continue some of the decision makers. I understand they need it because Qatar invest in the economy. We saw that Trump in the visit in Doha in May actually say that the Qatar investment in Boeing saved Boeing. And
Mm.
it's not
Right.
just shady business. It's really money that help, but
Mm.
the cost, the problematic nature of the source of the money, this is why I'm here talking and alerting.
Right, exactly. And so, and I think that's a good point you just made. It's not that there are no benefits to doing business with Qatar. Boeing, like you pointed out, it turned out to be a fair shake for them. Um, it promotes American business and economy and whatnot. Not to mention, of course, like you point out with England and other countries where they have their, if you like, investments. But the question is, um, like, what is tied in with that, right? What's the, how to say, what is what's the cost? What's it going to cost us in the long run having these political ties to the business? Like, is it really worth it at the end of the day?
No, it isn't worth it. And I give you some examples. For an example, we saw not a case that everyone talk about. Okay, Hurricane Katrina, when it's happened in New Orleans, Qatar was one of the states that, as a humanitarian actor, donated money to a New Orleans community to help rebuild, etc., etc. Some of these donations go to university in New
Mm.
Orleans. And we
Right.
saw that the academic institute was important to Qatar because first it's helped to rebrand itself. Later on, Qatar branded itself as pro-education. There is actually education city in Qatar. Some of them with American branches like Georgetown and we saw also until recently Texas A&M, and there are campuses on Doha soil, but
Hmm.
we saw that the narratives taught in these schools and eventually came to the US is anti-American. We
Hmm.
saw actually in 20, just 2 months after October 7th, Georgetown, Qatar initiated discussion panels, and some of them was about the deadliest invasion of the US to Iraq. And we saw actually a Qatari with the stamp and the facade of university discussion. But we
Hmm.
saw how they promote anti American narratives, and we saw it also in the Qatari media. We saw it in the fact that through this legitimate facade, we saw how, even right now, when Trump is actually hugging the Qataris more than ever, Al
Mm.
Jazeera is still promoting anti Semitic caricatures, still promoting anti Trump. I mean, at least don't anger the one that pays you. And no, for Qatar, the non-alignment
Yeah.
factor is important, and for
Mm.
that reason, we saw how Islamist clerics and Islamist terrorists sometimes get fund, sometimes get amplifier for their rhetoric, sometimes by not official Qatari politicians, but in fact. Um, a lecture in Qatar University or Qatari media, not just Al Jazeera, but Middle East Monitor, Middle East Eye, or El Arabi. And we saw that the fact that the US trusted Qatar in the long run, it didn't pay off.
Yeah. Exactly, because the way you lose essentially is through the fact that they buy their way into the educational institutions, and through that they are able to influence essentially what is taught at the universities, at the colleges, at the
And it's going down. There
and it's
are
working its way down. Yeah.
there are programs to train headmasters in the school district, and we saw how Qatar and the US cooperate. Actually, not just Qatar and the US. Just this morning, for example, Qatar Investment Authority announced the investment in Cuba University. But still, the same method that we need to affect the population and not just affect politicians. We need to affect the population. And we saw it, for an example, in Texas. We saw how educational funds and nonprofit organization receive money from Qatar, and we don't know where this money goes and why this money goes. Just this morning, there was an announcement about an organization in the US that called Dawa USA. Its
Mm.
stated goal is to promote Islam in the US, and Qatar did an agreement with them. I didn't even know who is the CEO because this organization is so unknown.
Yeah.
But we understand that this money don't go eventually to promote peace, but actually to promote subversive facts.
Yeah, exactly. So subversive is to put it lightly. I mean, they're basically brainwashing whole generations of American citizens, um, and, and basically, to my understanding, the brainwashing isn't that they're so-called pushing, if you will, full Islamic agendas, but it's making it to where the actual effects of Islam in the world is downplayed. Or I've noticed, for example, that they'll basically be the ones who are funding Marxist and socialist and communist ideologies, or the LGBTQ community, right? I mean, it seems like they're in bed with anyone that can basically destroy the society, not just through what it avoids, emphasizing, if it's emphasizing terrorism and radical Islam, but it's also degrading society. Is that a good? Am I putting that correctly?
I think that what you call the Green Red Alliance is
Correct.
very very comfortable to Qatar, because Qatar actually put money everywhere they can. Actually,
Mm,
there are even Jewish institutes that there are claims about Qatari money,
yeah.
because you first give the money and later you ask questions. And
Hmm.
indeed, they didn't want to promote necessarily even the horrific demonstration, the violent demonstration. I don't think necessarily that someone push a button in Doha and this began. I
Hmm.
think that Qatar understood the power of using a progressive discourse. For an
Mm.
example, we saw how Che Guevara is became by Qatar promoted as the one that he's a hero,
Freedom
and we
fighter.
freedom fighters. And
Yeah.
we, in the same manner, we saw how in a Qatari outlet, for an example, not Al Jazeera, Doha News, the October 7th was presented as the time that freedom began, because we
Wow.
are actually broke the chains, broke
Mm. Yeah.
the
The
fences.
the barriers. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Mm.
Qatar knew how to use these kind of narratives and use it, for an example, to promote in the global south narratives, and to promote, as you mentioned, Marxist ideology. Not because Qatar believe it, Qatar is capitalist. They actually
Right.
more. And because in Qatar, it's not a matter for what you promote, as long it's first affect the population for the long run, and
Hmm.
second, as you mentioned, can dismantle the society from within.
Hmm. And basically creating useful idiots for whatever they want to plan further in the future. They have an easy society to control because society is ignorant of actual history, actual real knowledge, and are being fed. I mean, are they also influencing a lot of social media giants? Because I have a feeling that what I've seen, at least as a trend in the past few years, is anytime I try to put a truthful post out there that I know to be the truth, because it's coming from the horse's mouth, it's coming from me living it out here. I know what I'm seeing, I know what I'm talking about. And it's like I get a wave of hate, a wave of, all kinds of curses at me and whatever. And I'm like, since when is the person who's informing the masses about what's happening live from location the bad guy? It's insane.
First, let's not give Qatar all the credit. There
Right.
are other bad guys, but
Hmm.
I think that Qatar knew very well how to speak to this kind of new medium. For that
Hmm.
reason, we saw Qatar investment in X, and actually most initiatives of Elon Musk, XAI, and Tesla. We can see that it was very important for them to invest in Musk. In the
Hmm.
same manner, we saw Qatar use its own platforms, for example, AJ Plus, that is Al Jazeera, that's actually branded more for teenagers. And we saw it in the fact that the Middle East Eye, another Qatari outlet, you can see how they can take a case and twist it in order, for an example, when Britain faced a massive um, wave of criminals, some of them Muslims, and from immigrant communities, not Muslims because they were Muslims, because some of them came from not respecting the law, kind of thing, let's say like that.
Yeah. Right.
And we saw that Qatari outlets brand the activities of the British police as Islamophobia. because you targeting communities.
Right.
And Qatar knew how to brand narratives that was effective, they're easy to sell, and distort the truth in a manner that is actually difficult to distinct what is right, what is wrong, what is actually reporting, and what is totally bogus.
Yeah. Well, another area that I found it to be interesting in my research that came up was that Qatar, there was a company in Qatar that has bought out EA Sports. I don't know if you've heard of that. The EA Sports gaming uh, um, platform, which is the largest FIFA sports, and they have a bunch of other different sports games, which are massive and have global reach, to a bunch of youngsters that are going to be using that platform. So it makes me wonder. I mean, why do you have investment in that, right?
I mentioned before greenwashing. Actually, the more familiar term is sports washing. And the Gulf,
Right.
as general, did it. We need to understand that the Saudis and the Emiratis and Qatar actually, in some of soft power, as it's called in research, soft power race, who buys more football clubs and buy influential players. There was actually an absurd situation. In 2024, there was a case that Qatari Emir come to Elysee Palace. 20% of the Elysee Palace fund, by the way, is bought by Qatar. But never mind. Um, to the Elysee Palace, and we saw an absurd situation that President Macron, the French president, Emir Tamim, stand, and between them, they're standing Mbappe, and actually you saw the camera, the three of them talking, and Tamim, the Qatari Emir, say to Mbappe in face of Macron, you don't gonna make us embarrassment, right? Because the understand of Qatar about the sports, not just football, by the way.
Mm,
FIBA 2027 in basketball will happen in 2 years in Doha also.
of
And
course.
we saw how Qatar, the World Cup in 2022, they didn't brand it as the more fun way because there wasn't much alcohol available in this sort of fun. But Qatar actually, and this is became much less funny, actually used this facade to promote itself as the safest World Cup. And this is
Mm,
how you can see Qatari security in the Paris Olympics, in Tour de France, in the Milan Olympics in next year, and in the US World Cup. They
wow.
gonna be the one that's granting security, the one who funds terrorists.
Makes perfect sense.
Now to the gaming part. The
Crazy.
gaming was actually a very, very effective instrument because we saw how first you can convince youngsters that didn't see a problem with Qatar. I mean, it's the
Right.
one that we saw it on football shirts.
Right.
And later on, we saw how they have great involvement in FIFA, in UEFA. We need to remember FIFA president Jinhiali, and I hope I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right. He has a house in Qatar. And for that reason, to use this leverage to be as pro sport, and this is how when youngsters in mostly in the US, and we saw actually since Trump rose to power, Qatar even funded the tournament of the UFC in Doha because they
Right.
understand that Trump like wrestling, and for that reason, we saw how Qatar knew the value of sport as a soft power instrument. And as you mentioned, the merchandise, the gaming part, it's just a byproduct that Qatar saw first an economic advantage, and later
Hmm.
on, influential advantage.
Yeah. And again, it might sound like we're just doing this witch hunt on Qatar, right? And it sounds all too oddly familiar because this is what I keep hearing from these Western political pundits, right? These armchair experts, that claim that Israel has its fingers in everything. And the more I research what Israel has actual influence in the world, I'm learning that more and more Israel has a lot less involvement in world, economy, power, whatever, than if you compare it to Qatar or other countries. I mean, we don't even come close to many countries in the long list of influential countries in the world. Am I wrong on that?
No, because as you mentioned, first we have a lot less, and second, the American Jewish money, let's say like that, okay?
Yeah.
It's so scrutinized in the way that you can't, as American Jewish billionaire, to donate wherever you like. You
Mm-hmm.
actually, there are cases when you saw, I mentioned before, AJ Plus. You saw actually cases they targeted APAC money as dark money,
Right.
as the deputy in the Qatari embassy in Washington call APAC dark money, and at the same time you saw a lot of money, much more, came not just from Qatar, we need to acknowledge that, but
Yeah.
mainly, but we saw it from Qatar in a way that some of them is legitimate, some of them is business partner, some of them we saw it even in business courts, even sorry, in courts. We need to remember that just 2 years ago, Bob Mendes from the Democrats got a verdict because he got bribes from Qatar, and
Oh wow.
we know there are cases that the Qatar sometimes list their agents in Farah. Some of them brand as consultative firms that we know that work with Qatar,
Right.
and for that reason there was actually an example, I think, William Bennett, the most recent purchase of Qatar. It was the second, and I hope I remember right, the Secretary of Education in Carter, I think, I'm not sure which one. And uh, was a Secretary of Education, and Qatar, and it's well documented. You can Google it, and the Qatar listed them as its agent, and later on he became the most prominent member that actually support Qatari donations to U.S. education system, because why not?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, as you saw for an example in Pam Bondi, the AG, there he also documents about Qatari money and the being agent. And we saw that Qatar sometimes use it as a legitimate cause, sometimes it's illegitimate, and sometimes we think it's legitimate, but as actual fact, we saw it later how it's much no.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting you pointed that out because when I did some research, I'm trying to understand the latest obsession that people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Nick Fuentes, or I don't know, this long list of people, and it's like they're just obsessed. And so I found it very odd that an America First TV commentator who's so-called representing of the conservative movement in America, who's also been a keynote speaker at Turning Point USA, which also I find to be just quite frankly outrageous. And I'm talking about Tucker Carlson on his show in March of 2025. He had Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman bin Yassin Al Tuani, or I don't know how if I said his name even remotely close, even though I'm from the Middle East. I don't really know too many Bedouin names, at least not from Qatar. But this is the Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs of Qatar, and also the Prime Minister of Qatar, right? And the ones who initiated this meeting or arranged for this to happen was an organization. When you look into it, right, is Lumen 8 Advisors, which just so happens to be that when you do a little bit of that's filed under FARA, by the way, we do a little bit of research, you find out that they get a payment of $180,000 a month from the Qatari embassy in Washington. Now, isn't that ironic and interesting? More than that, when you dig a little bit deeper, Rebecca Diaz Bonilla, who is the president of this firm, she has to go to Qatar, and she exclusively has to fly on Qatar Airways, of course, first class or business, and she is forbidden from going to any other of the North African countries or anywhere in the Middle East without Qatar's approval. That to me sounds like leverage. It sounds to me like somebody is paying you to push a narrative. And ironically, it's Tucker and friends that I just pointed out that have actually been calling, was it calling the kettle black, or however you say that statement in English, that basically that we're claiming Israel has its influence in Washington and in, like you said, in APAC and this and in Hollywood, and we control everything. And I'm like, if we control everything, why are we so stupid with that power? Why do we put ourselves in a disposition where we keep hurting ourselves politically, if that were true?
So actually, it's interesting because the same interview you mentioned of Tucker
Yeah.
Carlson with Mohammed bin Rahman Al Thani, Qatari Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, it's given an example to these cases. Why? Because actually, Qatari Prime Minister was plain innocent. He said, "I hear all about Qatar and how they behind all things." And actually, he addressed this issue and
Mm.
plain innocent, like we didn't know that, first of all. And second, he actually talked with Carlson about Qatari ties with Steve Witkoff,
Right.
the emissary of Trump.
Correct.
And he mentioned that they broke bread, as he called it, with Steve Witkoff, and they really broke bread. I mean, Qatar actually helped Witkoff from its debts when he bought some hotel, and he mentioned the Qatari Prime Minister how he was in the wedding of Witkoff's son. Witkoff's son, Alex Witkoff, is
Mm.
prominent speaker in Doha Forum. Doha Forum, that is most respected decision maker panels, and you see how these ties go from the academics to the business sector to inflation in government and to inflation in civil society. And this kind of cycle that cuts on you. How right now I giving money to a member that seem insignificant, and it's gonna benefit, it's gonna be influential for me in the long run. Sometimes you gonna will promote Qatar, as you mentioned, as a respectable member.
Yeah.
Sometimes you will attack Israel. Sometimes you do both. Sometimes I just want you to promote, let's say, more discussion. And this is how Qatar knew how to play the game, how to play the field. As you mentioned, Israel don't have enough money, power, or influence like Qatar has in Washington.
And like those that are the America First crowd claiming, right, that we have all this influence and power and making Americans do such and such and waste their money on Israel and power and influence, and we bend Washington to our every whim, which I just found again. I find to be again when because I like to look at facts. You know, when people make claims like that, I want to see, okay, show me where and how is that at all remotely true. And yes, there is Jewish lobbies in America, just like you have Islamic lobbies in America, just like you have Hindu lobbies in America, and just like you have Christian lobbies in America, you have everybody and their brother who has their personal interests lobbying in America. So the fact that you have people like Tucker and others claiming that APAC and the Israeli lobby groups are exclusively somehow unique, it's to me the biggest smokescreen I've seen in recent years. That people are just hook, line, and sinker believing and following for, and I just found that to be outrageous. And more so, to prove my point, I want people who are listening to this conversation research Tucker about Islam 5 years ago, 10 years ago when he was working for Fox, and listen to how he uh, basically, I mean, he states what Islam really is and how it does has nothing to do with Western values and beliefs. And then after this conversation with the Qataris, right, that he gave him a platform, the way he talked about Islam and well, Qatar's not that bad. You don't have prostitution, you don't have alcoholics, you don't have thieves, you
You
don't.
have both, by the way.
Yeah, and it's like, well, do you know how they get that? Like, like what you were anti 5, 10 years ago about Islam and how they achieve those goals is what you're promoting it as. They're such a beacon of light for Western civilization. You know what I mean? It was just disgusting to watch because it was such hypocritical and disingenuous. You watch me 5, 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I haven't changed my tune because I'm not paid or bought by anybody for my beliefs, for what I'm saying. Now, if I come, of course, to new realizations about things or whatever, we all do, you come and admit it and you say it openly. Hey, I was wrong about this. Here's why. But he didn't give any explanation, right? It just boom out of nowhere, he changes his tune. And that makes me question, why are you changing your tune? Again, also about Israel. He used to be pro-Israel. Now he's vehemently anti-Israel. Why? Why is that?
And I think that, as you mentioned, it's not a problem about the Islamic beliefs. Okay, I mean, we saw Muslims that are loyal to the U.S. They're a Muslim in Israel. And it's not about the religion part. Actually, in Qatar itself, my latest article is about I called it Steve Drink, about the alcohol issue in Qatar.
Yeah.
And it's actually saw that in Islamic, real Islamic, to preserve religious beliefs and customs, Qatar even isn't loyal to that. And this is how it's problematic because discussion is good, but we saw it, as you mentioned before, when you give not Islamic State but Qatar as a state that promotes not what people actually believe,
Hmm.
but some distorted version of it. And we saw how the same country, there was a case that was very, very problematic when the deputy in the Qatari embassy in Washington actually used its X platform to start attack Americans, the Western Journal opinion editor, one journalist, Elia Kobi. And we saw you are a guest in this country, you from the embassy. How you got the nerve to start to attack the specific names?
Right.
And for that reason, we saw that it's not about Muslim values. It's about how money corrupt the system. It's how
Yeah.
about the fact that actually there are professors in the US, in Qatar, US professors, that some of the terms they need to work in the American branches in Doha was you are not gonna criticize the emir,
Hmm.
and you actually distort freedom of speech. And
So they can criticize you, you can't criticize them.
exactly. And you actually saw that it was actually a case that you teach your curriculum is about arts, for an example. And how you gonna teach art in a state that is very, very conservative? You're gonna change the curriculum. And
Hmm.
you saw how this bad influence is affected public discourse, academics in terms of knowledge, it affects of our public debates, and this kind of poisonous influential, this is why it's problematic. Not it's because Islam, as you mentioned, Islamic, Christian, Hindus, everyone has the rights. There
Hmm.
was a case, the last rally that Vance did, was there was a kid that actually called Israel anti-Christian because they prosecuted the Christians,
Right. The Christians are
and
being persecuted. Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly,
Again, thanks
and
to Tucker Carlson, who interviewed two
exactly,
people
and you
that had
saw the
nothing to
fact.
do with Christian persecution in Israel. Both
Now,
of them from the PA.
see the fact that the one of the few churches in Qatar is actually banned from presenting Christian symbols from the outside. They need to do it on the inside. Even the
Wow.
streets didn't call church; it's called religious part.
Nah.
And it's fine to have a discussion. It's fine to talk about beliefs, but
Yeah.
what Tucker do, what other influential members by Qatar and by others, they
Yeah.
don't cover the truth. They distort it.
They whitewash it. Yeah, they completely whitewash it, and that's infuriating. I mean, again, I don't like to overemphasize people like Tucker and others, but the fact is, they're the ones that are putting this propaganda out there that people in the West are buying by mass, because it's someone that used to speak a language of conservatism and Christian values, and now they're just lashing out on Israel and making these wild accusations. And like you pointed out, I mean, the irony is that they also on their show were talking about Christian persecution in Israel, and I've already done explaining this off this issue that Munther Isaac, that was interviewed, this pastor from Bethlehem, that it's under PA control. It has nothing to do with Israel. So how is it that he is an authority to talk about that? On the other hand, I had Ihab Shalian, who is an Israeli Arab Christian, who is also a decorated soldier in the IDF, talk about the Christian persecution, if at all, in Israel. And he says, no, that is not the case. Quite the contrary. So I have on my platform a real Christian from Israel, and Tucker has two fake representatives of the Christian community that doesn't live in Israel, because the other one was the that nun, who again from Bethlehem, and she talks about Christian persecution and Beth, and I'm like, you mean under the PA, the Palestinian Authority? For people who don't know what I'm talking about, the PA, they're the ones that control Bethlehem. Okay, it's not Israel. It hasn't been Israel for since 2000. Like, what are you guys talking about? And it's whitewashing at best. To me, that's you must know that you are selling bold-faced lies to the public. You can't tell me you're that ignorant. You can't tell me that you can find one candidate in Israel. I have many Christian candidates that I could offer, and you can find one of them that lives in Israel to talk about Christian life in Israel. That's astounding, in my opinion.
Exactly. I think this is why when you talk about these kind of forums and this kind of gatherings and this kind of social media influencers, we saw that there was an article that Qatar funded 200 of them, and at the beginning it seems not problematic
Right.
because we just saw, okay, so they gonna promote Qatar as a city because they want to attract tourism, and but as you mentioned, right now there are influentials that say that on X their uh, their expose get a little more a little coverage because of it. And
Mm.
later on, we talk about the fact that you can't. hear, as you mentioned, the real facts on the ground, because your source of knowledge, actually, the source of knowledge about what's happening in Gaza was Al Jazeera.
Right.
And we saw how sometimes, it was there was a case about the terrorist that presented itself as a reporter, Anas Sharif, made a piece about anger and about he actually staged it in a way that is very very clear to anyone who see the report, but it didn't matter because the headline was starvation, and nobody bothered to ask why or actually compare it to the situation in places like Sudan and the
Yeah.
places there actually hunger.
Exactly.
And and this is why actually just this morning Qatari education minister on the UN platform on UNESCO say about how the whole world talk about persecuting Christians and anti-Semitism, but in fact ignore it when it's come to Palestinians. But
Yeah.
as everyone in Israel knew, it's actually more lies than truth.
Hmm. Yeah, and that the Palestinian cause is way more important than the at this point it's millions of Christians globally that have been butchered and killed in actual genocides that have been happening for let's say the past 10 years. Nobody's concerned about those countries. Nobody knows, has ever heard of what's going on in Nigeria, what's happening in Sudan recently, what's happened with this butcher of Syria, the new ruler that has been welcomed into European countries and Washington as this hero of democracy of Syria. The dude is an absolute butcher that committed actual genocide during the Gaza war, and nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about the Druze that were being butchered there, the Christians that were being butchered there by the hands of his henchmen, his Al Qaeda henchmen. And again, it's like it's amazing to me how real atrocities in this world are being ignored, and all of this is because of power players, like you were saying. These are power players. They buy influence and literally are influencing the world opinion on what matters when real issues are really happening, but they're over inflating non-issues, where there is partial starvation in Gaza because of Hamas not giving you food, not because Israel and the rest of the world hasn't poured a ridiculous amount of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Yet they're starving, and real starvation and real genocide in the world is ignored. It's not even a blurb on any headline anywhere. That's
That's
insane.
rewarded that the Palestine itself is an instrument, because the second Israel retreated along the last ceasefire and Hamas began to butcher Palestinians, Qatar news outlets it's not just they didn't report it. There's actually campaign in Al Arabi and in Al Jazeera that try to label some Palestinians as betrayers,
Oh,
traitors,
traitors. Yeah.
because they work with Israel, and
Yeah.
was a legitimation of their murder. And
Right.
even some Qatari figures that claim about Salah Jafrawi that Israel killed him by proxy. And this is how that even the Palestinians themselves not interesting as a group would
Yeah.
deserve. No, it's when it's helped to attack by them Israel, they're a good instrument. But the second it's just about Palestinians, nobody's scared.
It's amazing. So another thing I want to point out here, because the question that needs to be asked is why should we care about Qatar's role in the world? What's the big problem, right? So just to give people a little bit of perspective here, Iran is a nation that is trying to race to have nuclear capabilities to basically usher in the like the Gog and Magog war, okay, like Armageddon, okay, the final doomsday scenario. I mean, this is what these people are bent on. This isn't my propaganda ranting. This is literally from the horse's mouth. This is what the Ayatollahs envision for the future if they get their hands on these weapons of mass destruction. And part of those weapons they have fired at Israel, the less lethal ones, with the attempt of doing just that. And if it wasn't for absolute miracles, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. So we literally lived through DEFCON 1, which I don't know any country in the world that's reached DEFCON 1. Israel has in the past few months during this ongoing war. Why am I bringing up Iran? Because Iran and Qatar have so Qatar is Sunni, Iran is Shiite, so they're two Islamic worldviews completely opposing of each other, 100%, anywhere else in the Islamic world. But they actually have a bromance. They have a bromance, and it is over a power, and it's for power, right? And each one wants their own angle of that. And so, can you talk about that and what essentially why is it dangerous that we are allowing Qatar to get into the world arena, if you like, when, like you pointed out just earlier, that they have ties to supporting terrorism globally?
So first, as you mentioned about this bromance, actually President Trump mentioned the fact that Tehran owed a big deal to the Thani because they actually really saved them in the last round of negotiation with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there is, and according to Qatari MO, even to them, they are not loyal to the end. And I think this is why this is so problematic. As you mentioned, with Iran, at least you know how to be careful. You know, this is your ideology. This is what you're going to do, not going to do. You're going to support terrorism, and you know who the enemy is.
Right.
In Qatar, the
Because they're
problem,
open about it. They don't hide
yeah,
it. They don't
exactly.
cloak it. Yeah.
And in Qatar, the problem is that the one you trust as the legitimate partner is the same one that right now Trump is trusted them in Gaza to help rebuild Gaza, whatever you gotta do there.
Yeah.
And the same Qatari leadership meet with the Islamic University of Gaza, Hamas stronghold, in order to make sure that Hamas is relevant in the education system in the day after.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the same time, the one you trust is the one that betrays you. In Iran, I know to what I handle for. And but in Qatar, you need, let's say, to sleep with one eye open because both sides, as Qatari John Kerry actually heard it from Qatari Prime Minister. It was in WikiLeaks. He told about Qatari Iranian ties, and he said the Qatari Prime Minister, we are allied to them, they are allied to us, and everybody knows it. And this is kind of the Qatari conduct. The
Yeah.
way that you actually trust someone that at the same time, it was amazing when Trump visited in Doha in May, last May, during the meeting of the Emir with Trump. The Qatari Prime Minister, the one that was guest at Tucker, goes to CNN that also have a headquarters in Doha, and
Surprise.
say to him, I think the American threat from Gaza is unnecessary. I mean, you got the nerve. The president is here. At least wait until we leave the country. Because the narrative, the concept of Qatar is to be not loyal. And for that reason, we know that in Afghanistan, for an example, the same organization that trust Qatar to build their humanitarian initiatives are the same one that goes to Qatar because they know they talk with the Taliban and help them fund their Islamist education.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why Qatar is such problematic. Not because it's a strong ideology, because its ideology is betraying everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And essentially, to boil it down, is that Qatar is fueling every major terrorist organization in the world today. To my knowledge, there isn't one of the major ones. I'm talking about the major ones that have global reach, that want to not just terrorize within their own countries, if it be Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, or here in the Gaza Strip, or wherever. These are terrorist groups that have their tentacles in Europe, in North America, in South America, in Africa. Um, Anywhere you look, these terror organizations are basically, all of them, to my knowledge, are getting Qatari funding, and essentially also funding not just the weaponizing and the training, but also the ideology, or the jihadist preaching and teaching, like you were pointing out there, in if it's in school initiatives or what have you, for Muslims. It's not just Western influence that they're influencing, but it's the fact that they're permeating within their own Islamic community these radical ideologies, and funding the ones who are going to carry out the attacks.
Not necessarily because they promote. I mean, you need to remember the clerics in Qatar is actually not Qataris, it's Hindus and Bengalis and Pakistanis. I
Okay.
think that they use Islamist agenda as a horse that you can ride on. For an example, you mentioned before the butcher Al Julani in Syria. It
Yes.
was a case that one of the investors of the international airport in Damascus was from Al Hayat family in Qatar, two brothers, Motaz and Remy. And these brothers actually embraced by Tom Barak, Trump emissary to the region, and the same two brothers that a London court 4 years ago ruled that they have ties to financing Al Qaeda. And this is why the terror aspect and the financial aspect, legitimate business partners or legitimate humanitarian actors that during the day doing legitimate business, during the night funds terror, not because Qatar believe it, because Qatar knew this is the way you became very, very influential. Because when the terror attack will happen, you will go to Qatar to help you negotiate with this terrorist.
Another thing that I found very interesting through my research, and reading your articles as well, is a very telling case for why Qatar should have zero involvement in peace negotiations with Israel and any of our neighbors, and that is that their perspective on the 67 borders. Can you talk about that? How they see that, which I think is very telling for their stance on basically how they see us in this region. Period, and accept us or don't accept us.
So it's interesting because in every official statement of Qatar, you will see the formula that we want 1967 borders with East Jerusalem, and it's you just take copy paste, copy paste, copy paste. But when you examine Qatari outlets, when you examine Qatari public figures, and sometimes even Qatari politicians, you see that Kiryat Shmona is described as a settlement, and later on you see when you look for an example, the anti-Semitic editor that actually call to Hamas to kidnap more soldiers, Jaber El-Harmi, is the one that when he gave example to the brutality of Zionism, he said that look at Jaffa in 1947, because for them it's not about Jewish state existence, because the narratives they promote, sometimes anti-Semitic, sometimes anti-Western, is actually don't perceive the right of exist to Israel.
Right.
And we thought, as you mentioned, this is why it's so problematic in Qatari mediation. The fact that even official politicians, Qatari spokesperson, we saw how they use the language they use. They didn't even call them hostages. They called them prisoners or captives. They didn't see them as
Innocent.
innocent. And
Yeah.
this is why, and actually, this is why we saw it in the same way in other fronts. The Qatari mediation in Rwanda, Congo, is actually was instrument for Qatar to receive influence in both states, not about the peace itself. The
Hmm.
negotiation in Russia, Ukraine was in the same example. The negotiation between right now, US and Iran, US and Venezuela, is
Hmm.
in the way that both sides believe that this is the one that's gonna bring the talks further, but there is a reason Qatar agreements collapsed
Yeah.
sometime 2 weeks after it happened because they didn't address the underlying problems. They just doing the cover. And in the case of Israel, they do it in a very, very biased manner that preferred Hamas and want to preserve Hamas power.
Exactly. It's usurpative. And so that's what I noticed is like when they talk about 67 borders, they're talking about pre 48. They're talking about essentially we do not recognize, if the bottom line is we do not recognize a Jewish presence anywhere in any of the territory of the modern state of Israel, pre-state of Israel, period. Is that a correct understanding that I'm having from of how they're approaching the so-called negotiations of land rights and whatnot?
First, true, but we need to remember, as you mentioned, Qatar is not loyal to, as we mentioned, Qatar is not loyal to no one. If it right now help them to establish themselves in Washington, they need to acknowledge Israeli sovereign right. They will do it because, as the U.S. perceive them, we are business first. We want to get things done. So
Mhm.
this is why as I mentioned before, it sounds problematic. I prefer the Iranians because at least with them, you know who you're dealing with. You're
Right.
not dealing with one that promise you thing at the table, and later on you acknowledge the fact that actually betrayed you with a knife in the back, in your back.
I think that's a pretty good summary on why Qatar is a very big problem. I mean, that right there sums it up. The fact that an Israeli who, like I said, came under the largest ballistic missile attack in modern history or in any modern warfare, and thankfully survived by miracle, mostly, not because of Israel's greatness or ability to defend itself, but statistically, literally because of a miracle. Um, that from that very nation that tried to wipe us off the map, you just said that you'd rather negotiate with them than Qatar. That I think says it all. That says it all to me right there. And people
Again, I
should
don't like
understand that.
just to be clear, I don't like the Iranians.
No, I didn't say you did, and neither do I. But the fact, but that's the thing, right? Is that we would rather negotiate with a country like Iran that wants doomsday, because that means, right. So to be clear for the audience here, right, what that means is I know what I'm negotiating with, who the other side is. I know their intentions, and I know how to deal with it. Right, Israel is dealing with it. Right, Israel says, "Fine, you guys understand power and strength. Fine, then we will counter you, and we will send our Mossad agents, and we will target facilities and installations that are strategic, and we will eliminate those, and keep messing with us, and we can play that game as well." So it doesn't mean obviously that we're going to sit down and at a negotiating table and have a real conversation, but the fact that we will bring them to the negotiation table through power, through strength, and whatever means possible. Um, And that to me is telling, and should be a sounding alarm to anyone around the world who is questioning Qatar's legitimacy and Qatar's why in at all should Qatar have any involvement with these peace talks, which, like you pointed out, immediately broke out into Hamas breaking those ceasefire negotiations. And I was there in Gaza when they did it. So I know firsthand on this last deployment before pulling out of Gaza from our missions that we saw it firsthand. Like you said, they tried to attack bases and try to steal and kidnap the bodies of soldiers to have more negotiating power against Israel yet again, while so-called returning hostages to us at the same time. Absolute insanity. And you wonder how we got to that, because we have Qatar negotiating on their behalf.
Exactly, exactly, and we saw this problematic conduct from the beginning, and uh, we understand that there gotta be a footprint, Qatari footprint in Gaza, because the Americans want so, and this is why we need to remember to learn more about this actor, because it's here and it's dangerous for Israel.
Well, Dr. Ariel Admoni, I really, really appreciate your wonderful insights into this tricky subject. It's hard to discuss it with people today, because like you're pointing out, they're very good at disguising what they do. And I was talking to a friend just today about this, and he said, the fact that nobody even knows where Qatar is. If you ask them, do you know where Qatar is? Can you point it out on the map? They don't have a clue. Um, and it's just one of those countries that it's literally that. There's a lot of ignorance, and I don't blame them, because we also pointed that out here too. That it's also internally here in Israel, we have a lot of ignorance as Middle Easterners that live in this region to Qatar and their worldview and how bad they are for Israel. Um, so I really appreciate your insights and bringing some real clarity and a lot of good research for people to do a deep dive on this. Where can people find you? Where can people find your research and to get more information and follow you?
I'm writing on X, and try to not repeat myself. I try to give knowledge when I read from Qatari perspective, and there are articles and other projects that in the pipeline. Some of them I can talk about, some of them I can't talk about,
Mhm.
and actually there are a lot of I mean I get from Africa, from Canada, from the US. A lot of them ask me, some of them invite me to give a lecture, to present, as you mentioned, where on the map we can find you, and
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm happy to.
That's wonderful. So we will make sure to have your information in the description below, folks. If you have a serious speaking engagement opportunity that you would like to invite Mr. Ariel to, then you can do that. Obviously, you can follow him online on X, and again, we'll have all of those links below in the description of this episode, folks. If you like this, if you enjoyed this, you've heard me say this repeatedly, but again, I'll say it again. People are not going to hear this because the algorithms are not going to push it, because this is truth on platforms that like to suppress truth, and they like to promote nonsense like channels about, I don't know, cats or whatever. But these are very important subjects, and I know that if you've listened all the way to this part of the interview, then you realize what a value this is to you. And make sure to share it. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and get the message out there so that many more people can be informed with the truth about these important subjects that we brought here today. Thank you for listening, y'all. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and shalom from Israel.